Welcome to the Heart's Haven. Let the story begin. A poor girl saves an injured stranger in the rain. The next morning, he arrives in a helicopter. Rain hammered the streets of Seattle so hard that night, it blurred the city into streaks of silver and shadow. Cars hissed through puddles. Neon lights trembled across wet sidewalks. Most people hurried past with their heads down, collars raised against the cold, desperate to get home before the storm grew worse. But one little girl kept walking alone. 9-year-old Ellie Harper pulled her oversized hoodie tighter around her thin shoulders as she hurried down Mercer Street, clutching a paper bag beneath her coat to keep it dry. Inside were 2 rolls of bread and a small cup of soup already turning cold. It wasn't much, but it was dinner. And somewhere 6 blocks away, her mother was waiting in a tiny apartment with flickering lights and a broken heater. The wind howled between the buildings, sharp enough to sting her cheeks red. Ellie lowered her head and kept moving. That's when she saw him. At first she thought it was a pile of wet coats near the alley entrance beside an old pharmacy. People ignored things like that in the city, especially at night, especially in the rain. But then the figure moved, barely. Ellie froze. A man lay against the brick wall, one hand pressed weakly against his side, rain soaking through his dark coat. His breathing was uneven. A silver watch glimmered beneath the streetlight, strange and expensive against the dirty pavement. Water streamed down his face as though the storm itself was trying to wash him away. People passed by without stopping. A taxi splashed water across the curb and kept going. Somebody glanced over, then looked away. Ellie swallowed hard. She should leave. Her mother would be worried. She was cold, exhausted, and still had a long walk home. But the man's eyes opened for half a second, and in them she saw something she recognized immediately. Not fear, loneliness, the kind that hurt quietly. Ellie stepped toward him carefully, her soaked sneakers splashing through puddles. "Sir," she whispered, "can you hear me?" The man tried to speak, but only a weak breath escaped. Thunder rolled overhead. Ellie looked around desperately. Nobody was stopping. Nobody cared. Her small fingers trembled as she pulled off the knitted scarf wrapped around her neck, the faded blue one her mother had made years ago, before illness stole the strength from her hands. Without thinking twice, Ellie pressed it gently against the man's injury to shield him from the freezing rain. "It's okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. "Please don't fall asleep." The man's eyes flickered again. For one strange moment, the noise of the city seemed to disappear completely. No traffic, no thunder, no sirens. Just a little girl kneeling in the rain beside a stranger everyone else abandoned. Then suddenly headlights swept across the alley. An ambulance. Ellie stumbled backward as paramedics rushed forward with a stretcher. Voices echoed through the storm. Questions, radios, footsteps splashing through water. One medic turned toward her. "Kid, did you stay with him this whole time?" Ellie nodded quietly. The paramedic stared at her in disbelief before looking down at the unconscious man. His expression changed instantly. "Oh my God," he muttered under his breath. Another medic froze beside the stretcher. "That's Adrian Cole." His eyes widened. "The CEO of Cole Aeronautics." Ellie blinked, confused. The name meant nothing to her. But as the ambulance doors slammed shut and red lights disappeared into the storm, she had no idea that by morning, the most powerful man she had ever met would come looking for her. The rain had weakened by the time Ellie finally reached the apartment building on Pine Avenue, but the cold had settled deep into her bones. Water dripped from the ends of her hair as she climbed the narrow stairwell to the 4th floor, her sneakers squeaking softly against the cracked linoleum. The building smelled faintly of old pipes and burned toast from someone's late dinner downstairs. Apartment 4B waited at the very end of the hall. Ellie pushed open the door carefully, trying not to wake her mother if she had finally managed to fall asleep. But the familiar sound of coughing reached her almost immediately. "Ellie?" A weak voice called from the couch. "Honey, is that you?" Ellie hurried inside. "I am home, Mom." The apartment was small enough that every sound filled it completely. The old lamp beside the couch flickered with a tired, yellow glow, barely warming the room. Blankets covered Rachel Harper from her shoulders to her feet, though she still looked cold. Her face had grown thinner over the past few months, her skin pale beneath chestnut brown hair tied loosely back. Ellie forced a smile even though her hands still trembled from the storm. "I brought soup." Rachel smiled softly at that, the kind of smile mothers gave when they wanted their children to believe everything would somehow be okay. "You should have kept yourself dry first." Ellie knelt beside her and handed over the paper cup. "It is still warm, kind of." Rachel noticed immediately that the blue knitted scarf was gone. Her eyes lifted. "Ellie, where is your scarf?" For a second, Ellie hesitated. Then quietly she told her everything. About the alley, about the stranger in the rain, about the ambulance lights disappearing into the night. Rachel listened without interrupting, though more than once her expression tightened with concern. When Ellie finally finished, the room fell silent, except for the soft tapping of rain against the windows. "You stayed with him alone?" Rachel asked gently. Ellie lowered her eyes. "I could not just leave him there." Something fragile moved across Rachel's tired face then. Pride, sadness, love, all tangled together. "You have your father's heart," she whispered. Ellie looked down quickly at the floor. They almost never talked about him anymore. Before either of them could say another word, thunder rumbled faintly outside, and somewhere beyond the apartment walls, a helicopter passed low across the city skyline. Neither of them paid attention to it. Miles away inside the private wing of St. Matthew's Medical Center, Adrian Cole slowly opened his eyes. The room around him was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the distant hum of hospital ventilation. Soft morning light spilled through enormous windows overlooking downtown Seattle. Expensive flowers sat untouched near the wall. Two security officers stood outside the door. But Adrian barely noticed any of it. His memory came in flashes. Rain, cold pavement, a small trembling voice. "Please do not fall asleep." His hand moved weakly across the blanket until his fingers brushed against something resting beside him. A faded blue knitted scarf. He stared at it for a long moment. Not designer, not expensive, handmade. Rainwater still clung faintly to the fabric. One of the doctors stepped closer. "Mr. Cole, you are very lucky. Another 30 minutes out there and things could have been much worse." Adrian barely heard him. His eyes remained fixed on the scarf. "Who found me?" he asked quietly. The doctor glanced toward the security guard. "We were told it was a little girl." Something shifted in Adrian's expression then. Not shock, not curiosity, something deeper. Because for the first time in years, someone had helped him expecting absolutely nothing in return. And somehow, that hurt more than the injury itself. Morning sunlight crept slowly through the cracked blinds of apartment 4B, painting thin golden lines across the faded carpet. The storm had passed during the night, but the city still looked washed out and gray beyond the window. Somewhere below, traffic groaned awake. A bus hissed to a stop. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance, like part of the city's heartbeat. Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor beside the couch, carefully counting quarters and dollar bills into small piles. $3.80. That was all they had left until Friday. She tried not to let it show on her face. Rachel slept lightly beneath the blankets, one hand resting against her chest as soft morning light touched the tired lines around her eyes. Every breath seemed to take effort now. Ellie noticed things like that more these days. Children always noticed more than adults realized. Quietly, Ellie stood and walked to the tiny kitchenette. She filled a chipped kettle with water and placed it on the stove. The apartment heater rattled loudly, but barely produced warmth. She rubbed her hands together and glanced outside. That was when she heard it, a deep, rhythmic sound in the distance. Thump, thump, Thump. At first she thought it was thunder returning, but the noise grew louder, vibrating through the thin apartment windows. Rachel stirred awake slowly. What is that? Ellie stepped closer to the window. Then her eyes widened. A helicopter was descending over the empty gravel lot across the street. People were already spilling from nearby buildings onto fire escapes and sidewalks below, pointing upward in confusion. The aircraft gleamed silver beneath the pale morning sky, massive blades cutting through the air as wind whipped trash and rainwater across the pavement. Ellie stared, speechless. Helicopters did not come to neighborhoods like this. The aircraft touched down carefully in the center of the lot, sending loose newspapers spiraling into the air. A sleek black SUV pulled up seconds later beside it. Rachel pushed herself upright slowly on the couch, concern flashing across her face. Ellie, stay away from the window. But Ellie could not move. The helicopter door opened. A tall man stepped out wearing a charcoal coat over a dark suit. One side of his face carried a faint bruise near his temple, partially hidden beneath the morning light. Even from 4 stories above, there was something unmistakably commanding about him, the kind of presence people noticed immediately, and in his hand was a faded blue knitted scarf. Ellie's breath caught. No way, she whispered. Down below, neighbors had completely stopped moving now. Some held phones in the air recording. Others simply stared. The man looked up toward the apartment building, directly at her window. For one impossible second, Ellie felt as though the entire city had gone silent again. Then there was a knock at the apartment door. 3 calm, measured knocks. Rachel looked frightened suddenly. Ellie, who is that? But Ellie already knew. She crossed the apartment slowly, her heartbeat pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The hallway outside remained perfectly still, except for the distant hum of helicopter blades below. Another knock, gentler this time. Ellie reached for the doorknob carefully and opened the door just a few inches. Adrian Cole stood on the other side. Up close, he looked different from the man in the alley. Cleaner, stronger, but somehow more tired too. His dark hair was still slightly damp from the morning mist, and beneath the sharp lines of his expensive coat, exhaustion lingered quietly in his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian slowly lifted the blue scarf in his hand. I believe this belongs to you, he said softly. Ellie stared at him in complete shock. Behind her, Rachel covered her mouth with trembling fingers as recognition crossed her face. Even she knew who Adrian Cole was. Everyone in America did. But Adrian was not looking at the apartment, or the peeling walls, or the poverty surrounding them. He was only looking at Ellie, the little girl who had stayed beside a stranger when the rest of the world kept walking. For a long moment, the tiny apartment remained completely silent, except for the distant chopping sound of the helicopter outside. Ellie stood frozen in the doorway. Adrian Cole, billionaire founder of Cole Aeronautics, was standing 3 feet from her, holding a faded blue scarf like it was something priceless. I washed it, he said quietly. I hope that was okay. Ellie blinked twice, still trying to understand how any of this could possibly be real. Yesterday, she had been standing in freezing rain beside a stranger everyone ignored. Now the same man had arrived in her neighborhood with a helicopter that was probably worth more than the entire apartment building. Rachel finally found her voice from the couch. Ellie, invite him in. Adrian glanced toward the small living room before stepping carefully inside. The apartment suddenly seemed even smaller around him. The peeling paint, the flickering light bulb overhead, the old couch patched with hand-sewn fabric. Yet there was nothing mocking or uncomfortable in his expression. If anything, he looked strangely humbled. Ellie closed the door softly behind him, while the sound of curious neighbors echoed faintly from outside the hallway. Adrian's eyes moved carefully across the room until they landed on Rachel. He offered a respectful nod. Mrs. Harper. Rachel looked embarrassed suddenly, brushing loose strands of hair behind her ear. You know my name? I asked the paramedics questions after I woke up. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. They said a little girl stayed beside me in the storm until help arrived. I needed to find her. Ellie lowered her eyes awkwardly. I just called for help. No, Adrian said softly. You stayed. The words settled heavily into the room, because both of them knew the truth. Most people would not have. Adrian slowly stepped closer and handed the scarf back to Ellie. Her small fingers wrapped around the soft blue fabric carefully. It still smelled faintly like rain. My mother made it, she whispered. Adrian nodded once. I figured someone who loved you made it. Something in Rachel's expression shifted at that. Not fear anymore, recognition. Like she was seeing a side of this powerful man the world rarely saw. Ellie looked up carefully. Are you really the helicopter guy on the news? For the first time, Adrian almost smiled. Sometimes, he answered. That tiny response made Ellie laugh quietly despite herself, and somehow the sound changed the entire room. The tension softened, the coldness faded just a little. Then Adrian noticed the untouched medicine bottles near the couch. His expression darkened slightly. Rachel followed his gaze and looked away quickly. It is nothing serious. But the cough that interrupted her sentence said otherwise. Adrian remained silent for a second too long. Years of business meetings had taught him how to read people quickly. Investors, politicians, competitors. He could spot fear before someone even spoke. And this apartment carried fear everywhere. Fear of overdue rent, fear of empty refrigerators, fear of sickness getting worse. Ellie suddenly moved toward the kitchenette. I can make coffee, she offered quickly, trying to sound grown up. Well, not fancy coffee, just regular. Adrian watched her carefully as she reached for mismatched mugs in the cabinet. Children were usually nervous around him, impressed by his money, curious about his fame. But Ellie was different. She acted like kindness was normal, like saving someone in the rain did not make her extraordinary. And somehow that affected him more than any boardroom speech ever had. Rachel studied him quietly from the couch. Why did you really come here, Mr. Cole? The question lingered in the room. Outside, helicopter blades continued turning slowly against the gray Seattle sky. Adrian looked toward Ellie as she carefully poured hot water into cracked ceramic mugs. Then he answered honestly. Because last night, he said quietly, your daughter reminded me what kind of person I used to want to be. The apartment fell silent again, and for the first time in many years, Adrian Cole realized that the warmest place he had entered in Seattle was not his glass penthouse overlooking the city. It was this tiny apartment with flickering lights, chipped mugs, and a little girl who still believed strangers were worth saving. The smell of instant coffee slowly filled the apartment, warm and simple, mixing with the faint scent of rain drifting through the cracked kitchen window. Outside, the helicopter still rested in the gravel lot like something unreal, its silver surface flashing beneath the pale Seattle morning. Inside apartment 4B, time seemed to move differently. Ellie carefully carried 2 steaming mugs to the small folding table near the couch. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear anymore, but from nervous excitement she was trying hard to hide. I only had powdered creamer, she said apologetically. Adrian accepted the mug like it belonged in the finest restaurant in the city. Honestly, this already beats most meetings I attend. Rachel let out a quiet laugh at that, though it quickly turned into another cough she tried unsuccessfully to suppress. Adrian noticed. Again. He had spent years surrounded by polished people trained to hide discomfort behind perfect smiles. But illness had a language of its own. The tired eyes, the guarded breathing, the way Rachel subtly pressed her hand against her ribs when she thought nobody was looking. His expression grew more serious. How long has she been sick? He asked gently, looking toward Ellie. Rachel answered before her daughter could. Mr. Cole, really, you do not need to concern yourself with us. That was not the question. His tone remained calm, but there was something firm underneath it now. Ellie stared down into her mug. A few months, she admitted quietly. She stopped going to the doctor after the insurance ended. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. The room became very still. Outside, people continued gathering near the helicopter below, their voices faint through the walls. Somewhere in the hallway, a neighbor whispered Adrian's name in disbelief. But Adrian barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on the little girl sitting across from him in oversized sleeves, trying to sound brave while discussing things no child should ever have to carry. "What about family?" he asked softly. Rachel gave a tired smile. "It has been just us for a while." Ellie glanced toward the framed photograph resting beside the lamp. Adrian followed her eyes. A man stood in the picture beside a younger Rachel, smiling with one arm around a much smaller Ellie at Pike Place Market years earlier. "He passed away?" Adrian asked carefully. Rachel nodded once. "Construction accident," she whispered. 5 years ago." Adrian looked at the photograph for a long moment. Something tightened behind his eyes before he looked away again. Loss recognized loss. No explanation was needed. Ellie suddenly stood from the table. "Wait here." She disappeared briefly into the bedroom corner, separated by a hanging curtain, and returned holding a small plastic container wrapped carefully in foil. "My mom made blueberry muffins yesterday," she said shyly. "Well, before she got too tired." Rachel looked embarrassed. "Ellie, honey, those are for later." But Adrian accepted one gently. The muffin was slightly uneven, clearly homemade, still carrying the faint sweetness of blueberries and cinnamon. He took a bite, then unexpectedly laughed under his breath. "What?" Ellie asked nervously. Adrian shook his head slowly. "I have chefs who charge $500 for breakfast meetings." He looked at the muffin again. "And somehow this tastes more real." Ellie smiled at that. A real smile this time. Not cautious, not worried, just a child smiling because someone finally saw goodness in the small things she tried so hard to protect. And in that tiny apartment filled with chipped dishes and secondhand furniture, Adrian Cole felt something unfamiliar begin to return to him. Warmth. Not the kind money bought, the kind people gave freely when they still believed the world was worth being kind to. The morning slowly stretched into afternoon, but Adrian made no move to leave. Outside, the crowd near the helicopter had finally begun to thin. The excitement of seeing a billionaire in one of Seattle's forgotten neighborhoods had turned into rumors, photographs, and whispered conversations drifting through the apartment building hallways. Inside apartment 4B, however, the world felt strangely quiet. Ellie sat on the floor near the couch, drawing in an old notebook with dull-colored pencils, worn nearly flat from use. Every few minutes she glanced toward Adrian, like she still expected him to disappear. Most adults did. But Adrian remained seated at the folding table, jacket folded neatly beside him, listening as Rachel spoke softly about hospital bills, overdue rent notices, and jobs she could no longer physically manage. He listened carefully, not like a businessman waiting for his turn to speak, like someone finally hearing things that mattered. "And the landlord has been patient," Rachel said gently, though even she did not sound convinced anymore. But patience only lasts so long. Ellie pretended not to hear that part. Instead, she focused harder on her drawing. Adrian noticed immediately. Children always found ways to protect the people they loved. He looked around the apartment once more. The patched curtains, the nearly empty bookshelf, the tiny stack of unpaid envelopes carefully hidden beneath a magazine near the television. Things most people would overlook. But Adrian had grown up poor before success erased that chapter from public memory. He remembered exactly what survival looked like. And this apartment was surviving. Barely. Ellie suddenly stood and walked toward him, holding the notebook against her chest. "I made something," she said shyly. Adrian accepted the paper carefully. It was a drawing done in uneven blue and gray pencil. A little girl standing in the rain beside a man beneath a streetlight. Above them, Ellie had drawn enormous wings stretching across the sky. Adrian stared at the picture for several seconds before speaking. "Who is the angel?" he asked quietly. Ellie pointed at the small figure. "The girl," she answered simply, "because she stayed." Something inside Adrian shifted painfully at those words, because nobody had stayed for him in a very long time. Not after the divorce, not after his company consumed every waking hour of his life, not after success turned every relationship into negotiation. He swallowed slowly and looked back at the drawing. "When I was little," Ellie continued softly, "my dad used to say that being rich does not mean you have money. It means somebody would miss you if you disappeared." Rachel lowered her eyes immediately, emotional from hearing her late husband's words again. But Adrian sat completely still. That sentence landed harder than any criticism from investors, reporters, or board members ever had. Because suddenly he realized something terrifying. Millions of people knew his name, but almost nobody truly knew him. The apartment grew quiet again until Rachel's coughing returned, harsher this time, forcing her to lean forward against the couch cushions. Adrian stood immediately. "That is enough," he said firmly, though kindness remained in his voice. Rachel tried to wave him off. "It passes." "No," Adrian replied gently. "It does not." He reached into his coat pocket and removed his phone. Within seconds, his expression changed into the calm authority of someone used to making impossible things happen with a single conversation. "Marcus," he said into the phone, "I need a medical team at Pine Avenue immediately." Rachel's eyes widened. "Mr. Cole, please, we cannot afford—" "You are not paying for anything," Adrian interrupted softly. Ellie looked between them in confusion. Adrian knelt slightly so his eyes met hers. "Last night," he said quietly, "you refused to leave a stranger alone in the rain." His voice softened even more. "So now it is my turn." Less than 30 minutes later, the narrow hallway outside apartment 4B filled with footsteps, quiet voices, and the soft rustling of medical bags. Two doctors and a nurse entered carefully, dressed in dark coats against the Seattle cold, their expressions professional but warm. The entire building seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors peeked through cracked doors. Someone downstairs whispered that Adrian Cole himself had brought a private medical team into the apartment complex. Another person claimed television reporters were already circling the neighborhood. But inside the apartment, none of that mattered to Ellie. She sat beside her mother on the couch while the doctors gently checked Rachel's breathing and blood pressure. Adrian stood near the kitchen window, giving them space, though his eyes never drifted far from Ellie for long. The nurse smiled softly at Rachel. "We are going to take very good care of you." Rachel looked overwhelmed. "I do not even know how to thank any of you." Adrian answered quietly from across the room. "You do not have to." Ellie watched him carefully. There was something different about him now compared to the man she had first seen standing at the door. Some of the sharpness had disappeared from his face. The walls around him seemed thinner somehow, as though kindness itself was exhausting him and healing him at the same time. One of the doctors approached Adrian after several minutes. His voice remained low, respectful. "She needs full testing at the hospital. Soon." Adrian nodded immediately. "Arrange everything." Rachel looked alarmed. "No, wait. I cannot leave Ellie alone here." "You will not," Adrian said calmly. The certainty in his voice quieted the entire room. Ellie looked down at her hands nervously. "Hospitals are expensive." Adrian's expression softened almost painfully at that sentence. "Children should worry about homework, birthdays, favorite songs on the radio, not hospital bills." "Ellie," he said gently, kneeling slightly in front of her again, "you saved my life yesterday without asking who I was." She nodded slowly. "So let me help your family without asking how much it costs." Ellie stared at him for several seconds before giving the smallest nod in return. Outside, camera flashes suddenly flickered through the apartment windows. Adrian's security team near the hallway exchanged tense looks. The news had arrived. Within minutes, helicopters from local stations circled above the neighborhood skyline. Reporters crowded near the street barriers below, eager for photographs of the billionaire CEO standing inside one of Seattle's poorest apartment blocks. Marcus stepped quietly into the apartment beside Adrian. "Sir, this is becoming a media situation." Adrian barely looked away from Ellie. "I do not care." "The board will." For a brief second, silence settled heavily between them, because both men understood what that meant. Investors hated unpredictability, and Adrian Cole had just landed a helicopter in a struggling neighborhood to help strangers. The story would spread everywhere by nightfall. Marcus lowered his voice further. "They are already calling this emotional instability after the attack last night." Ellie heard the word instability and looked worried immediately. Adrian noticed. He turned toward her with a calm smile that erased the tension from his face almost instantly. "Do not listen to grown people arguing about nonsense." That made Ellie smile faintly again. Then Adrian stood and reached for his coat. The room suddenly felt colder watching him prepare to leave. But before anyone could speak, he looked directly at Rachel and Ellie. "This is not a goodbye," he said softly. Then his eyes settled on the blue scarf folded carefully beside Ellie. "It is only the beginning." By evening, rain had returned to Seattle in soft silver sheets, coating the city in reflections of neon and headlights. Inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, the private cardiac wing glowed with quiet light and hushed voices. Rachel Harper sat nervously on the edge of the hospital bed while nurses adjusted blankets around her shoulders. The room felt impossibly large compared to apartment 4B. Clean, white walls, fresh flowers near the window, machines humming softly in the background. Ellie stood beside her mother, clutching the faded blue scarf tightly against her chest. Everything still felt unreal, especially Adrian. He stood near the window overlooking the rainy skyline, one hand in his coat pocket, listening carefully as the lead physician explained test results in low professional tones. "With proper treatment," the doctor said, "we are optimistic." Ellie did not understand every medical word, but she understood optimistic. And for the first time in months, she saw relief soften her mother's face. Rachel looked toward Adrian slowly. "I do not know why you are doing all this for us." Adrian remained quiet for a moment. Rain streaked across the glass behind him, blurring the city lights into soft gold and blue shadows. Then he spoke. "When I was 12, he said quietly, my mother collapsed at a grocery store while I stood there helpless." Ellie listened carefully. "We did not have insurance either." A faint smile crossed his face, though sadness lived underneath it. "A stranger paid for her medicine that night. I never learned his name." Rachel's eyes filled with emotion. Adrian looked down briefly before continuing. "I think part of me spent years trying to forget where I came from." His voice softened further. "Then a little girl stood beside me in the rain yesterday and reminded me." Silence settled gently over the room. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that wrapped around wounded hearts, slowly stitching themselves back together. Ellie walked closer to Adrian carefully. "So, somebody helped you once too?" He nodded. "A long time ago." Ellie thought about that for a second before smiling faintly. "Maybe kindness just keeps traveling." The words hit Adrian harder than she realized. Because in boardrooms, people spoke about power, about growth, about influence. But no one ever talked about kindness like it could survive generations. Yet here it was, alive inside a child standing in hospital socks beside him. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Marcus stepped carefully into the room holding a tablet. His expression looked tense. "Sir," he said quietly, "every major network is covering the story now." Adrian barely reacted. "The board scheduled an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." Ellie looked worried immediately. "Are you in trouble?" Adrian turned toward her. Then unexpectedly, he smiled. A real smile this time. Not polished for cameras, not practiced for investors, just human. Maybe, he admitted softly, but some things are worth it. Outside the hospital window, lightning flickered faintly beyond the clouds, and for the first time in years, Adrian Cole no longer felt alone watching the storm. The next morning, sunlight finally broke through the clouds above Seattle for the first time in days. Golden lights spilled across the glass towers downtown, across wet streets still shimmering from rain, and across the massive conference room on the 42nd floor of Cole Aeronautics headquarters. Television screens flashed headlines from every major network. Billionaire CEO rescues single mother after child saved his life. The little girl who changed Adrian Cole. Board members sat stiffly around the polished table, uneasy murmurs moving through the room like static. This story is everywhere, one executive warned. Investors are nervous. Another leaned forward. You landed a helicopter in a residential neighborhood, Adrian. They think you are becoming emotionally compromised. Adrian listened quietly. For years, this room had been his entire world. Numbers, contracts, acquisitions, endless conversations about profit margins and public image. Usually he knew exactly what to say, but this morning felt different. Because for the first time, he realized how empty all of it sounded compared to one small apartment filled with kindness. Adrian stood slowly and walked toward the enormous windows overlooking the city. When I built this company, he said calmly, I told myself success meant never needing anyone. The room fell silent. But yesterday, he continued, a 9-year-old girl with almost nothing stayed beside a dying stranger in the rain while hundreds of people walked away. No one interrupted him now. Do you know what frightened me most? Adrian asked quietly. Not the storm, not the hospital. He turned back toward the board. It was realizing that child had more humanity than I have allowed myself to feel in years. The executives exchanged uncertain looks. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and placed Ellie's drawing gently on the conference table, the little girl beneath the angel wings. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Adrian made his decision. We are launching the Harper Initiative, effective immediately. Several board members blinked in confusion. A nationwide program, Adrian explained, providing emergency housing, medical support, and family assistance for struggling single parents and children. One executive looked stunned. That will cost millions. Adrian nodded once. Then it is money finally being used correctly. Miles away inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, Ellie sat beside Rachel's bed, eating blueberry pancakes from the hospital cafeteria when the television mounted in the corner switched to a live press conference. Her eyes widened immediately. There he is. Rachel looked up just as Adrian appeared on screen beside reporters and cameras flashing endlessly around him. A journalist asked loudly, Mr. Cole, what changed your perspective overnight? Adrian paused. Then in front of the entire country, he answered softly. A little girl reminded me that people still matter more than power. Ellie stared silently at the television. Tears filled Rachel's eyes. And somewhere deep inside that hospital room, hope quietly returned for the first time in years. That evening, rain began falling once more over Seattle. But this time, Ellie stood by the hospital window, wrapped safely in warm blankets, while city lights shimmered below. Beside her, hanging carefully over the chair, rested the faded blue scarf that started everything. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness do not just save lives. Sometimes they bring hearts back to life too.